Alright, so over the weekend we got access to the footage of the brutal police murder of Tyre Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee, and there is just so much to say about this, honestly, but first I just want to say up front, I'm not going to play any of the actual footage in this video, number one, because I don't think that abides by YouTube guidelines, number two, because I think that it's not even necessarily, necessary for this type of a video, and because I think a lot of people have already seen a lot of the footage, but I'll go ahead and link some of the tapes that they released to the public in the description below if you haven't seen them yet. But I just want to get into this because I think that there is a lot to be said about the specifics surrounding the death of Tyre Nichols and also just broader critiques of the police system that we have here in the United States. So first off, I just want to start with this initial police statement that was put out in the aftermath of Tyre Nichols dying and then this entire story blowing up nationally. So basically the actual contours of the events that unfolded where Tyre Nichols was pulled over for alleged reckless driving, which we'll circle back to that here in a second. It doesn't appear, at least that I've seen, that there's any evidence whatsoever that he was even engaging in quote-unquote reckless driving, but that's sort of besides the point, because even if somebody is engaging in reckless driving, they don't deserve the type of brutality that Tyre Nichols was subjected to. But essentially you had him pulled over by the police, and then you have this group of police officers, a large portion of whom were part of what they called this Scorpion unit as part of the Memphis police force, and essentially there were 5 police officers, all of whom happened to be black, which again we'll circle back around to in a second. I think it's largely irrelevant because most of leftist critiques towards our police here in the United States are systemic critiques and not individual ones based on skin color. It is based on what the actual police function is in our modern society. But essentially you have 5 police officers who were just absolutely laying in to Tyre Nichols. They pulled him over, they dragged him out of the car, they were macing him, they were pepper spraying him, tear gassing him, kicking him while he was on the ground already detained, punching him in the face, literally holding his hands behind his back, teeing up on him with haymakers and beating him with a baton. So just unimaginable, unnecessary cruelty from these specific police officers. Now, given that sort of basic contour of what actually happened on the ground, let's just go ahead and get to this initial police report, because this is not anything that is unique. This is not anything that is surprising, but of course, police pretty much guaranteed are going to be lying in these types of situations when they think they may have done something wrong. And this is a perfect case study example into that phenomenon. This was also what we saw with George Floyd as well, where in their initial police report, they didn't even mention the fact that Derek Chauvin was kneeling on his neck for over 8 minutes, similar to this one here. Okay, so they say the Memphis Police Department initially released the following statement, quote, "On January 7, 2023 at approximately 8:30 p.m., officers in the area of Rains Road and Ross Road attempted to make a traffic stop for reckless driving." Again, they have provided essentially zero evidence that that was even the case, but again, kind of irrelevant because you don't deserve a death sentence for reckless driving. But they continue saying that as officers approached the driver of the vehicle, a confrontation occurred, whatever that means, and the suspect fled the scene on foot. Now, his mother has testified that in part of her very emotional testimony, obviously surrounding the death of her son, that he was fleeing because he wasn't trying to, ditch some sort of a, illegal firearm or drugs or something like that. He was fleeing because he was scared for his life, and obviously for good fucking reason, because these same police officers who say that he ran away from them ended up brutally murdering him. But again, they say that he fled the scene on foot, and then officers pursued the suspect and again attempted to take the suspect into custody. And while attempting to take the suspect into custody, another confrontation occurred. This is where they're talking about them brutally murdering him. And they say, however, the suspect was ultimately apprehended, and afterward, the suspect complained of having shortness of breath, at which time an ambulance was called to the scene, and the suspect was transported to St. Francis Hospital in critical condition. So virtually this entire portrayal of the events is a 100% straight up abject lie that they are telling here. They completely exclude the parts where, again, they were holding his hands behind his back and punching him in the face, kicking him while he was on the ground, while he was barely even conscious. The idea that he was, after the fact, after this entire situation unfolded, that he said, he's complaining about shortness of of breath. This guy was literally barely even partially conscious at the end of this entire ordeal, and the police essentially just propped him up on the side of one of their police cars, their police cruisers, and just left him there. And then the EMTs show up, and they failed to provide care for him for I think it was like 15 to 20 minutes once they got on scene as well. So it's just a failure systemically from top to bottom from the police forces that enabled this unit to even exist in the first place, from the police themselves who were directly involved in killing him, from the EMTs, the entire structure, the entire system that we have in place right now for policing things that, again, initially started, at least allegedly, about some sort of like a minor traffic violation or something like that. I mean, it's completely insane that we would end up with this type of situation, but again, not surprising that the police would be lying in their initial report about this. And then after this report comes out and after this story starts gaining a little bit of traction, we have the Memphis police chief who was basically coming out and warning the people who live in Memphis, disproportionately, obviously, black communities. This is a disproportionately, relative to other American cities, a black city. And so they were basically coming out and trying to warn and say, this footage is going to come out. Don't react violently. Don't go, starting, protests or anything like that, right? So they were basically gearing this up in a way where, based on the testimony from this police chief, from the head of the FBI, from the head of the Department of Justice, Merrick Garland. I mean, there were so many different top-level people who were coming out and warning people before this footage dropped about how intense that this was going to be, that you really knew that it was going to be very, very brutal, and that they were trying to sort of like get ahead of this, which ties into an entirely different conversation, honestly, about the fact that I think a lot of these police officers, a lot of these police, whether it's this police chief or other police officers or pro-police pundits or politicians around the country, they are trying to portray this situation as if it was like uniquely brutal, or as if it was somehow completely out of bounds for what normal police conduct is in this country. And now I would agree, yes, it should be considered that, but just based on the amount of brutal beatings from police officers that I've seen that are somewhat similar to the beating of Tyre Nichols, I mean, this was not something that was genuinely unique in the sense that it was, something that is not part of typical police practice, especially with some of these units like the Scorpion unit that are basically just going around terrorizing innocent civilians within these communities. Okay, so there's an important distinction there. I mean, obviously it's sort of uniquely brutal because we know what the outcome was. He ended up dying from his injuries because of how these police were interacting with him. I mean, it's uniquely brutal in the sense that, this is becoming a large story and we've gotten the footage from it, and it's obviously a horrible situation, but I want to make it clear that this is not unique in the sense that normal, everyday police officers don't engage in this behavior. This is accepted behavior. This is normalized behavior within their ranks, as much as they are trying to pretend like this was just 5 bad apples who just randomly woke up one day and decided, hey, we want to go, be extra violent today or commit a murder or something like that. No, I mean, obviously, if you see the way that these police were acting in some of these videos, I mean, even after they had propped him up on one of these police cruisers and they were done with the entire thing after just absolutely beating the shit out of this guy, beating him to death, literally. You see how they interact with each other, and I mean, they're pretty much like fist bumping each other and almost celebrating. I mean, they're almost like jubilant in that moment and saying like, oh wow, we got him, like we did a good job in this type of a situation, knowing that their body cam footage is on and all of that. So I mean, it's not a situation here where this is something where you should be like, oh, this was just bad apples in this situation, and so the solution is just to cycle through different police forces and try to weed out a couple bad apples here and there. Like, no, this obviously to a large degree had to have been normalized within this department, within how our police conduct is operated nationwide, that this would even be able to take place in the first place. And I'm 100% sure that this is not the first time that even this specific Scorpion unit was involved in this type of brutality towards citizens. I mean, this is something, again, that I've seen so many different times. It just so happens that Tyre Nichols ended up dying and it blew up into this national story, but this is not completely out of bounds for how police in the United States typically operate. So I just want to give you guys a little bit more details here in terms of sort of the timeline of events and how this all unfolded. So here from Axios, they say what we know about the fatal police beating of Tyre Nichols. They say 5 former Memphis Police Department officers have been charged with second-degree murder and other crimes over the death of Tyre Nichols, a 29-year-old black man who died days after he was fatally beaten by police officers during a traffic stop on January 7th. Okay, so they have been charged. They're being charged with second-degree murder. I think that is the correct charge in this circumstance. But I mean, again, it kind of strikes me as a situation where it's like, people are going to react to this, and I've seen a lot of this from conservatives and many liberals as well, where they'll look at this situation and they'll just say like, well, the police officers got charged. What more can you expect from this, situation? And they've also apparently disbanded the Scorpion unit, and they're taking these steps specifically against these individuals. But it's like, that's not the real critique. That was never the real critique here. The real critique from the left, the people who were in support of defunding the police, for example, it was always systemic, and it never had absolutely anything to do with the color of the skin of the police officers involved in these systems. It was always a systemic critique. It was always a structural critique of how police are being operated in the United States, and how we could more effectively use some of these resources that we are dumping into police departments to terrorize average American citizens, disproportionately obviously black and brown communities in the United States. It was about how we could reallocate those resources towards more effective community social programs that would actually, number one, reduce crime in the long run, and also improve people's material conditions in the shorter run, and also help to get a lot of these police departments shrunken down from their absurdly bloated budgets. So I mean, again, the idea here that like, oh, these officers were charged and then that's it, clean up, at the end of the day, that's the whole story, that's all that needs to be done. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. It entirely overlooks the actual systemic critiques that a lot of people have of the police here in the US. But they continue here saying that apparently an additional officer was relieved, the sixth officer who was involved in the traffic stop, as a part of their ongoing investigation into Nichols' death. And they go on to list the 5 police officers who were arrested and fired. Their names are Tadarius Bean, Demetrius Haley, Emmett Martin III, Desmond Mills Jr., and Justin Smith. And again, they were charged with aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, official misconduct, and official oppression. And they say that no charges have been made against that 6th officer, which is really just like a recent and the last day development. But they continue down here saying that the city of Memphis publicly released the footage of the traffic stop on January 8th. Okay, so here's where we get to a little bit of a contradiction from this initial police report that they put out. They say, in the footage, which includes graphic, violent content and depicts 2 separate encounters between the police and Nichols, at least 5 officers are seen either kicking and punching Nichols at the corner of a residential street, as well as hitting him with what appears to be a baton and forcing him on the ground. And after the assault, which lasted at least 3 minutes, 2 officers dragged Nichols to the side of a police car, where he was left without medical attention for around 20 minutes. And throughout the footage of the assault and the initial traffic stop, Nichols did not appear to have physically assaulted any of the officers, and is repeatedly heard saying, "all right" and "okay," as multiple officers restrain him. And I mean, again, it's just such a fucking tragic and brutal story here. But he was apparently also like calling out for his mother. He was really close to his home at the time that this occurred. So I mean, just like the most horrific shit that you could possibly imagine for what he actually had to experience in that moment. And again, I'll link the footage down below. I'm not going to show it in this video, but it was absolutely brutal to say the least. And they continue here saying that the department has since disbanded this specialized police unit involved in his arrest on January 28th, and the unit, which is called Scorpion, which stands for Street Crimes Operation to Restore Peace. Okay, let me say that again. This organization, this unit that they have here, Scorpion, stands for Street Crimes Operation to Restore Peace. Okay, and the members of this unit were just caught on footage, and again, this cannot possibly be the first time that they have engaged in this type of behavior. We're caught on footage just savagely beating somebody over what even by their own standards was at maximum, like maybe you could say fleeing, or maybe you could say reckless driving or something like that. I mean, just completely insane, the idea that police in general, or this specific Scorpion unit, was there to restore peace in any way, shape, or form. But they also say that the Department of Justice and FBI Memphis Field Office are investigating whether Nichols' civil rights were violated. I don't know how you could possibly dispute that, but they also say that members of Congress have also not ruled out a federal investigation into the entire Memphis Police Department. And I think you definitely have to do that because, again, this wasn't just an instance where they just woke up one day and woke up on the wrong side of the bed and just on a whim decided to do this for the first times in their life. I mean, no, for them to act in the way that they did towards Tyre, for them to then, basically celebrate in the aftermath of it on the body cam footage. I mean, this has got to be, the umpteenth time that they have done this to somebody, and this one just happens to be blowing up into this national story. But again, I mean, there have to be countless other examples that, these types of police officers have been engaging in similar behavior that just doesn't end up getting media traction in the way that this one has. But they continue down here saying that it is still unknown why officers originally pulled over Nichols and why members of the specialized police unit were involved. So again, they said it was reckless driving. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. They say the total number of officers involved is also unclear, as is how many are currently under investigation. And they say despite the department's initial claim, Memphis Police Chief Sherilyn Davis said on January 27th that it has not been able to substantiate its earlier claim of reckless driving through a review of the footage. So even the police chief is saying that the reason why he was pulled over might just be entirely bullshit, which just makes this like that much more tragic that this might have just been literally started over absolutely nothing, like not so much as a like warranted traffic stop or anything like that. So I mean, it's just, again, just absolutely brutal story here. But we're to finish off here. They say the Memphis Fire Department is also conducting an internal investigation into the medical response with the EMTs who basically left him sitting there unattended for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, however long it ended up being. Now listen, my takeaway from this is that it's very unfortunate to me, although however much these police officers and pro-police pundits and politicians around the country are trying to make this seem as though it is a simple matter of bad apples within a police department, I think the biggest tragedy of this is that this story, the footage that we saw, although it was extremely brutal, it was not incredibly unique. In fact, I would say that one of the most unique aspects of this footage that we saw is that the police didn't end up like shooting him or something, or actually using direct like lethal force against him in that immediate moment. Obviously, they used non-lethal weapons, so-called less than lethal weapons, and ended up killing him anyways. But I mean, this type of brutality is not anything that is typically unique from what we saw in this footage compared to what we see on a weekly basis from U.S. police forces. So on that note, I want to give you a little bit more data on this. So here from The Guardian, they point out that it never stops. Killings by U.S. police reached a record high in 2022. They say that law enforcement officials killed at least almost 1,200 people, or about 100 people a month last year. So that's about 3 per day in the United States of U.S. police officers killing civilians. Okay, so that's where we're at right now. Record levels of police violence towards the American people. Now, take that in context with a lot of the media narratives that we hear about record crime waves all around the country. I didn't get to cover a different story that recently popped up on my timeline about the Walgreens CEO basically coming out and saying that they completely exaggerated the amount that petty theft and crime within their stores was leading to them having to shut down stores and increase security. So there's a lot that we could get into about the whole crime wave narrative and all of that, but I mean, you look at this type of data in contrast to the narrative that is typically put out about, oh my God, we have all of this rampant crime and murder and killing and all of that, and it's so horrific, we have absolutely no choice but to increase these police budgets to give them more military hardware, more resources, more funding, etc. And it's like, this is the outcome that you're going to get. I mean, we are years now removed from the single largest civil rights protest in American history, with the BLM protests in the aftermath of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor also being brutally murdered by the monopoly of violence that is wielded by the United States police force. But all we got from that was essentially inflated police budgets and these types of statistics. So I mean, this is where we're at right now. Again, it was absolutely brutal that what we saw with Tyre Nichols in this specific circumstance, but unfortunately we're talking about hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of other Americans who are also going through similar events on an annual basis right now, and a vast majority of those barely get any traction whatsoever. So I mean, again, this is part and parcel of how our police operate in this country. Now again, specifically with the Biden administration, the current president of the United States, what does he have to say about it? Say here from NBC News that the Biden budget proposal is calling for an increase in law enforcement spending. He says the answer is not to defund the police. Okay, so what is the response then? What is the answer? What is the actual solution here to the supposed crime wave, to the issues with systemic police violence that is wielded against average Americans, of course, disproportionately Black and brown Americans in this country? What is actually the solution? Is the solution to just endlessly inflate their budgets? I mean, we had a perfect case study example down in Uvalde where upwards of more than 40 to 50% of their city's budget is going towards this police force. They have all of this fancy equipment, this military gear, these bulletproof shields, the assault rifles that they have, the virtual, tanks, the armored cars that they have at their disposal, all of this funding that is being dumped into these police officers. And then when it's their time to shine and actually do something to save innocent lives, what do? Absolutely goddamn nothing. Okay, that's what they do, because police in the United States, and just generally as a socialist critique of the police force. This is not a system that exists in order to protect and serve average Americans or communities around the United States. They exist as basically the vanguard for the capitalist class. They exist to protect private property. They exist to protect the interests of the wealthy and the billionaire class. Okay, so this is why leftists frequently have a critique of police unions, for example, that they are not, part of the working class. They are in fact class traitors because of how their basic functioning is meant to operate. And this is why you see such a tandem with corporations, the police, politicians who are corrupted by corporations and the police. Perfect example would be Cop City down in my home city of Atlanta, Georgia, that I've been talking about on this channel, where you have this incredibly powerful and wealthy police foundation that is teaming up with multi-billion-dollar corporations that are based out of Atlanta, who are teaming up with corrupted city council politicians to essentially eviscerate what was supposed to be protected forestry and build an entire fucking city for police to go around and train how they can further brutalize the American people. And so again, this Tyre Nichols case was, obviously a really tough thing to watch if you ended up watching the footage. And, it was tough to hear a lot of the testimonies from his family members about, who he was as a person. I mean, just seems like he was an absolutely great guy. I'll link down below some other resources as well if you want to read more into who he was as a person and some of his interests and what his life was all about. But it was just really tragic hearing some of these stories coming from these parents and family members and loved ones who were around him, and just seeing that this was something that was potentially completely unnecessary, even from the outset, with their justification for pulling him over in the first place potentially being bullshit. But then on top of that, the added brutality that they subjected him to for absolutely no justifiable reason whatsoever. And then, of course, in the aftermath of that, the response from this is going to be, in all seriousness, if we're being real about this, no legitimate, real structural reform to the police, which is what the overwhelming majority of people, I think, want to see in this country. And it just can't happen because we have all of these powerful interests, whether it's the police unions, their foundations, whether it's corporate America backing them. I mean, we just have such structural barriers in place that even with something as tragic as this, where you have the police chief coming out and saying, this is going to be brutal, please don't riot in our cities or whatever, as if, they should have the right to not only, violently police and oppress these communities, but then also tone police how they are going to respond to that and how these communities are going to, rise up to try to resist that type of what is essentially an occupational force in their communities. I mean, it's just this entire cycle has been honestly disgusting to watch. I'm not even going to get into a lot of the conservative responses to this entire thing that I've seen. It seems like some of them are taking a pretty, one-of-the-mill road in response to this and actually condemning the police officers. But then again, you don't have any, structural critique. You basically just have individualist critiques from the overwhelming majority of what it seems to be our establishment class in this country, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. And unfortunately, we're going to have to see more circumstances like this take place the longer that we put off understanding the idea that crime and generally policing in this country is only going to be solved at the end of the day by reducing their budgets, reducing their weaponry, reducing their power, and increasing and improving on the material interests and the material conditions of average working class people in this country.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying